This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Andrew Bustamante. Andrew, I'm very excited for this chat. Thanks so much for making the time.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, Jay.
Okay, so here's where I want to start. I have a lot of folks on the show who share their opinion about what the biggest threat to the United States might be today. And some point to geopolitical tensions or trade aggression, or they point to China. They point to America falling behind from a technological or a weapon standpoint. Some point to internal cultural divisions and say, no, the problem is ourselves. This is the biggest threat, is America inside America. If I were to ask you that question as a jump-off point into today's interview, from your perspective, what's the biggest threat facing America today?
You know, I think it's a really easy question because it doesn't really matter what anybody's opinion is. And there's lots of opinions out there about what the biggest threat is. According to the Director of National Intelligence, which is the preeminent national security leader for the United States, the number one strategic threat to the United States is China. Everything else that you mentioned basically feeds up to a master umbrella that falls underneath of China. As China rises in terms of its geopolitical weight and success, as it rises in terms of its technological advancement, as it rises in terms of influence worldwide, all of the other secondary effects happen. You'll see more and more division and derision inside the United States, more and more pressure on the U.S. economy, less and less income that's coming from foreign investors and foreign buyers because they'll have an alternative in the Chinese market. Remember, the United States was built on the back of technology and financial markets. So as China develops its own technology and financial markets, it's creating competition in the global economy. That means that countries will be able to start doing business with China, where previously they only did business with the United States.
So would that be a fair lens, therefore, if you're trying to understand, every day there's a new splashy headline, some of them matter, most don't, but some do, and maybe it's a regional conflict in the Middle East or in Europe. Maybe it's something in the South China Sea. Maybe it's trade aggression coming from the U.S. Do you then step back and view that through the lens of U.S.-China competitiveness as you're cut out the noise, get to the signal filter?
That's exactly right. That is the only lens that matters. The lens of who is the top economic threat to the current national or the current global superpower. That is the only lens that we should have to look through. Because at any given time, there's a global superpower, a singular global superpower, the largest, wealthiest country in the world. And at any given time, there are only a handful of what we call near peer competitors who are trying to catch up to that global superpower. It used to be the UK when England was the global superpower. It used to be Rome before that. So the world has always seen different superpowers. Even during the Cold War, when Russia and America were vying to be the superpower, or the USSR and the United States were vying to be the superpower, the United States was still ahead of the USSR. So you can always look at the world through that lens and have a very solid idea of what will happen next.
So how would you draw the scoreboard then if you were to analyze those two countries, United States and China, and come up with some kind of analysis about where the strengths are and where the weaknesses are for each and how they stack up against each other today? Because that is probably the most commonly asked question. You mentioned it, we've seen in the last 600 years, 5 empires come and go, right? It's now the age of the American empire, but that too will pass. The question is when and who will take the baton. So if you were to draft that analysis, what data points would you focus on and how do the two countries stack up against each other?
Yeah, it's a great question and one that we could go into deep minutia if we chose to. So I'll try to keep it general to start.
Sure.
So the easiest place to look is at momentum. Momentum economically, momentum fiscally, and momentum in terms of geopolitical influence. When you look at the United States' momentum, our momentum is declining in multiple areas. The power of the US dollar is declining in momentum. It doesn't mean it's negative. It just means it's not growing as positively, as quickly as it used to in the past. When you look at our momentum in terms of geopolitical influence, our momentum is decreasing. So we're slowing down. If you think about two cars in a car race, both cars are going fast. They're both going 200 miles an hour, right? But the difference is that our 200 miles an hour is kind of steady or we're increasing at 2 miles an hour per minute. Whereas China, their momentum is increasing faster than our momentum is increasing. Fiscally, there's more wealth in China. There's a larger middle class growing in China. There are more and more world customers going towards China, towards their telecommunications, towards their electric vehicles, towards their technological solutions. China is continuing to increase its soft power in the developing world, whereas the United States is literally closing our soft power agencies like the Peace Corps and like the international aid that USAID that we've been focusing on for soft power. So you can literally watch as our momentum slows and China's momentum increases if you just look at those few indicators.
Now, the counterpoint to that, if I were to provide one, would say, and the momentum strikes me as, I completely agree. You look at China from 1990s to today, it's been just a runaway train, right? I think it had the GDP of Italy in 1990, very poverty-stricken nation. 30 years later, top contender for global superpower. That's a trajectory that the world's never seen before, And the Belt and Road Initiative they've rolled out over the last 15 years, effectively financing those developing nations, and maybe trying to bring the next generation of consumers of Chinese goods online, but I think strategic allies as well in the event of a U.S.-China partnership. And 150 countries, I believe, took Chinese loans through the Belt and Road Initiative over the last 15 years. So a lot of allies in theory, but the devil's advocate point would say, yeah, but the demographics are a mess and everything has to start with demographics. And if there's no consecutive generations to pick up the productivity, what happens? They had a policy that governed their population growth for a long time. It didn't work out so well. And you can't undo that with government incentives and policy. They're trying, but it's hard. It's hard, if not impossible. So what's your take on that?
It's a flawed argument, the demographics argument. And I understand why you're saying it, because there are many people who are parroting it. But the truth is, China is an overpopulated country. And the leadership knows that. It's heavily weighted towards the low productivity, low skilled, low educated populace. If you actually took away all of the old, uneducated, poor manual workers, if you took that away and you only left behind the educated, highly skilled innovators, you would have a population that looks much more like the United States. So the problem that really is facing China is that the leadership, the Chinese National Party, the Communist Party, is trying to come up with how do we cut off the low productivity population and give our high productivity population a chance to take off. Because as long as you're carrying 1.6 billion people, your overall GDP per person is very small, right? So because every 70-year-old unemployed former farmer is taking a fraction of that per capita GDP. In the United States, it's not like that. In the United States, we have a much smaller population, so now our per capita GDP looks much higher. Even though you and I both know you can't compare a New York banker and their income versus a Alabama restaurant waitress. You can't compare the two in terms of what their earning potential is. But when you nationalize GDP over per capita, that's exactly what you end up doing. I believe that what China's really planning on is a mass event in the not so distant future that's going to significantly decrease their population. It could be an invasion of Taiwan. It could be participating in some kind of global war. It could be sending troops or sending people to support operations that are being carried out by partners like Russia, Iran, or North Korea in their conflicts. It could also be transforming their healthcare model so that aging and 60-year-old plus peasants in the countryside simply expire because they didn't have children and they didn't have the social support network to keep them afloat. In the United States, that sounds inhumane, that sounds monstrous, except that we had the benefit of a civil war to do that to us. Our civil war killed millions of Americans, drastically shrank our population, and then created this artificial increase in our per capita GDP.
As you explain this, I find myself thinking about something I've heard you say before, where you discuss how people think, inside their existing framework, right? We all grow up in a framework, and you used a shed analogy once. We kind of grow up and we live in the shed, and my shed's different from your shed. You may have some coincidental ingredients like my socioeconomic setting, maybe some intentional ingredients like my state hierarchy, right? The reason I went there is because what you said about China planning for some kind of a mass depopulation event is a hard thing to wrap your mind around, and it sounds so dystopian, right? But you stepped back and said, well, let's contextualize this a little bit. Could you go a bit deeper into that? And why is it so hard for me to accept that is actually a strategy that the Chinese administration may be thinking about and maybe even implementing?
Well, I think part of the reason it's so difficult is because we've already forgotten history. China already went through a mass depopulation event during the Cultural Revolution. And they're not the only ones to have done it. Cambodia did the same thing. Russia did the same thing. Venezuela did the same thing, right? When revolutions happen, sometimes a focus on those revolutions is eradicating a subculture within the country that does not offer a return on investment for where the country is trying to go. Whether that means they're targeting wealthy people, whether that means they're targeting educated people. Don't forget that there was a genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis that happened in the last 50 years, for crying out loud. So we've seen these situations where mass population events have happened, and every time we see them, from an American point of view, we think it's crazy. We think it's immoral and unjust and unfair, but we still can sit there and watch it happen, right? In many ways, we could be watching the same thing right now with Israel's attacks against Palestinians in Gaza. And what are we doing? Of course, we're writing stories about it, and we're outraged about it, and we're writing posts on social media, but we're doing dick all to stop it. And that is a mass population event. Tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed in a small geographical area to transform the geopolitics and the demographics of that area for the long term. It's not as crazy as we think, but the problem is that the American mindset is very rarely focused on the past. We are a country that culturally is always focused on essentially the next 4 or 5 years. We look at 5-year goals and 4-year presidential terms. And, that's basically how we think. How long is college? 4 years. We just constantly think in this process. The average promotion cycle in the United States is 6 years. We don't have a long-term vision in the U.S. We're always focused on the here and the now and how we can move forward, which is especially funny when you hear the arguments about how Americans need to focus on, mindfulness in the moment. It's because we're so focused on the future, we don't learn from the past. And that's why it feels so awkward to us to say, how could this ever happen? Well, all you have to do is look in the past and you'll see how it can happen.
Yeah. I completely agree, man. Okay. So if I were to use your filter here, your China versus United States filter, and maybe analyze a handful of regional conflicts, I could look at the sort of series of coups in the Sahel region, and I think I get it. I could look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I think I get it. I could look at tensions in the South China Sea, and it's clear to me. It's less clear to me what's happening in the Middle East in terms of that U.S.-China lens. Would you be able to expand on how you process that conflict, Palestine, Israel, Iran, Syria, Azerbaijan now trying to play a bigger role in the Middle East, it appears. How do you process that through your U.S.-China lens?
So it's not really a U.S.-China lens. I want to flag this again. It's a lens of superpower and rising power.
Okay.
That's the true lens. Current superpower versus rising power. And the way that you have to look at that as it stands today, the United States became the global superpower in a bit of a nefarious way. It came out of World War II. And what we started doing was we started exporting forced democracy. So we demanded democracy from anybody who wanted to have access to the U.S. Economic market. If you wanted U.S. loans, if you wanted U.S. trade, you had to find a way to espouse democracy in your country. China was a democracy prior to 1949, right? The nationalist Chinese leader who fled to Taiwan was democratic by virtue and practice, right? So the reason I'm saying that is because when you look in the Middle East, you see a fake democracy. All across the Middle East, it's fake democracy. It's actual kingdoms and sheikdoms that have said they are now democracies when in fact they are still based on kingdoms and royal families. So they already know the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Oman, Bahrain, these oil-rich countries in the Middle East, they fully understand they're not really democracies. Not everybody has a vote. They don't really get a choice of open elections, but they put on this show. It's a very pragmatic relationship between the Middle East and the United States. That pragmatism being, of course, oil. The United States needs oil. The Khaliji nations have oil. The United States can say all sorts of bad things about Khaliji countries. President Biden did. He called them all sorts of terrible names and promised that we would break off relations with Saudi Arabia because of the travesties they have against human rights. But we didn't, right? Instead, he leaned closer into Saudi Arabian relationships, and you start to see an increase in the trade and the sales of American weapons to the Middle East. So the superpower understands it needs the Middle East. China, the rising power, understands that the centerpiece of oil, of natural resources and crude oil for the future is still in the Middle East. The problem is that ideologically, the Middle East is far more in tune with China, thinking pragmatically, thinking practically, thinking through a lens of kingdoms and fiefdoms and rule, much closer to that than they are to the idea of democracy or the promise of democracy. So when you look at that superpower, rising power relationship and you compare it to what's happening in the Middle East, that's what you're really seeing. Practicality versus ideology. And the Middle East is far more practical than it is ideologically aligned with the United States.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you if we're entering the sunset years of the American empire, and these things can take a very long time to roll out, whether it's the transfer of the world reserve currency or just the trade currency. Global geopolitical influence can take decades to. It's not in the best interest of the United States to lose that power. It's massively advantageous, specifically to control the world reserve currency when you're so laden with debt. It's very important they retain that power. As the threat against that power increases, people in general just tend to fight a bit dirtier, right? When your back's against the wall and you're at the tipping point, it's like you'll do anything to survive, right? Every entrepreneur knows this. If your back's really against the wall, you'll do whatever it takes. And obviously countries are no different. Does that line up? Do you expect the U.S. to start playing a bit dirtier than it has? And what might that look like? What do you think?
I want to make one thing. I want to just clarify again. I don't think the United States is in its sunset years. Okay. I think the United States is in a period of darkness. If I were to compare it to anything, I would compare it to the average human adolescence. Life was grand until you were about 12 years old. And then life was very complicated and shitty and confusing until you were about 27 years old. Mm-hmm. So 13 to 27 was a long period of time. And that came with all sorts of awkwardness. And sometimes there were highs and most of the time there were lows. And it was ugly, right? But by about 27, you figure your shit out. And you're either a winner or a loser by 27, right? There are some people who get a second chance. But by and large, I think if we count on 10 fingers, how many people really change their life after 27? It's going to be much smaller than the people who fit on one hand. That's where the United States is now. We have to figure our shit out in the next 15 years to decide, are we going to rebound, come back from this and remain the dominant superpower for another 50 or 150 years? Or are we going to fucking trip over our dick and end up being a loser for the rest of our existence? We have to figure it out in the next 15 years. I say all that because you're exactly right. We are already showing that we're willing to play dirty. The whole Trump administration, since the whole second Trump administration, is a giant exercise in playing dirty. From our policy on immigration to our waffling in Ukraine to our bombing of Iran and the threat of tariffs. All this is a giant demonstration of how we're willing to play dirty. We're willing to seize, in the Biden administration, we seized Russian assets. We seized Russian assets to try to put pressure on Russia to get them out of Ukraine. What the f- were we thinking? You can't take someone's money and claim that you're a fair and equitable trade partner. You can't do that, right? We did that as a way of showing that we're willing to play dirty. Because we seized Russian assets, that's a big part of why China pulled its assets out of U.S. banks. And the whole reason that countries are willing to diversify their currency away from the U.S. dollar is because we just sent a message to the world, your U.S. dollars aren't safe. Your currency held in American-controlled banks isn't safe. If you do something we disagree with, we're going to take your fucking money. And nobody wants to be part of a global economy where you can't trust the banks that you put your money in.
Right. And we've seen central banks all over the world buying gold at rates they haven't in 50 years. And I see that as the safe haven. It's like the hedge or the lifeboat. We're not quite sure which direction things are going, so we'll sit in the lifeboat till we figure it out, right? And then maybe they'll recycle that back into a currency. What is
Bitcoin? And Bitcoin is another perfect example of that, right? You've seen Bitcoin hitting all-time highs because people don't trust the US dollar like they used to. So they're hedging. They might still use it, but they don't like using it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the same. I transact in dollars. Obviously, I got 3 kids. I have bills, but I save in gold, to a lesser degree, Bitcoin, but both. When you say, so United States is in their adolescence, therefore they're in that like 16 to 27 year range. And right now is the time to figure our shit out. What does that look like? Because there's been a trajectory of like increasing, populism, I guess would be the best way to say it, but just like division from maybe 2008 or earlier, but from there forward. And these divides seem to get deeper and deeper every election cycle to the point where at times they look irreconcilable. Now, I know, you can look back at the 60s and say, we've been in worse places actually where political violence got a lot more real, but we're in a stage right now that looks pretty challenging to get out of. So what does figuring our shit out look like, Andrew?
Yeah, I think you got a couple of great examples already, right? First, the rise of the populist president is a major problem. That was never what we were built on. It's not what our Constitution allotted for. It's not what our electoral system was supposed to support. The fact that Barack Obama came in and basically started the populist trend. So it's ambivalent to left or right. It's all about whether or not you can basically land on a message that's popular enough to get massive amounts of people to take an action that they may not even understand. Right? And that's what happened with Barack Obama. You had a huge increase in voting base that started to participate when they didn't understand anything about politics. And that's the same target that you've seen every president since then. You saw Clinton pursue it. You saw Trump pursue it. You saw Biden pursue it. You continue to see presidents targeting groups of non-voters. Well, why would they target a group of non-voters? Because that's an ignorant group. They don't vote. They haven't voted in the past. They probably won't vote in the future. So all you need to do is find the right message to get them off their ass and into a voting booth one time to shift the scales of the vote. So that's why you've seen this push towards populism. If presidents and presidential candidates actually focused on policy and focused on leadership and focused on how to shape the country intentionally, they would only appeal to a small group of the voting base. Only the educated, careful, responsible voter would pay attention. And that's not going to swing an election like we've seen them swing in the last 3 or 4 cycles. Remember, we all expected a Clinton presidency. And then we saw a Trump presidency. And then we thought it was ludicrous that Trump would come back and run again. But then he won again. And none of us thought that we'd see a president where the whole world questioned their mental capacity. But that's exactly what we saw with Joe Biden. So we're not making presidential choices that are in the best interest of America. We're making reality TV happen on stage every day or every 4 years, right? So that's one thing we got to figure out. Another thing we have to figure out, frankly, is whether we want to be a democracy or whether we want to be a strongman autocracy. We have to decide that. That's not a Donald Trump thing. That's a lazy fucking American thing. We don't want to take responsibility for the decisions that have to be made at all forms of government, which is why most Americans don't participate in local government activity at all. We just want to outsource that We want to give that to politicians and give that to presidents and give that to Congress people and give that to local school board. Because then if we give the responsibility away, we can bitch about it when it goes away that we don't like. But if we actually participated in annual elections, semi-annual elections, if we mid-cycle elections, if we actually cared about the people that led our communities, our municipalities, our counties, we would have much more responsibility, much more say in what's really happening. So we have to figure out, do we want to be the democracy we were supposed to be? Or do we want to be a little bit lazy and just outsource that decision-making to people who we vote into office once every couple of years based on popularity? If we don't know, we don't know. We also have to figure out what do we really believe is right and wrong in the world? We can't say that we support freedom and then say that Ukraine is a democracy. They're not a democracy. So we're not supporting freedom when we support Ukraine, right? Ukraine was a corrupt country before Russia ever invaded. But we started telling ourselves that they were something else. And then we were surprised in the last 2 years when their actual corrupt nature started coming to light. Anybody who knew what was happening in Europe before in 2022, 2021, we recognized, like, even the nonprofit watchdogs of the world knew Ukraine was corrupt. So as we poured money into it and that money disappeared, we shouldn't have been surprised. The same thing with Israel and Hamas. We all knew that Hamas was both a terrorist organization and a local government. We knew it was both, just like we knew that Hezbollah was both in Lebanon. But we didn't want to accept that situation. We didn't have a firm opinion. So then when actions started being taken, there were people who were outraged on both sides. Like, a lot of Americans really do like to believe that the world looks like the United States. And that's not the case. The world looks completely different than the United States. We have the blessing and the benefit of being wealthy, powerful, and secure on basically all of our borders because of our geographic location.
You know, it struck me as I was listening that we're probably going to keep penduluming very hard election cycle to election cycle, as long as what you said, we can't agree on what is right or what is wrong, right? There's like a lacking of a cohesive ideology that maybe existed early days, but is not there anymore. And so it's almost like two countries, two cultures sharing one landmass, and that's a point of conflict. You could argue that. So how do you resolve that? How do you get past that, right? And maybe in like the political cycle, chaos typically leads to order eventually if the people get so frustrated and scared that they demand authoritarian rule as being superior to anarchy, right? And they just say, we want some form of control. We don't care what, and we don't care if it's hardcore, but this isn't working. This is too unpredictable, chaotic, and dangerous. And so could that be an outcome where you mentioned, do we want to be an autocracy? It's a question, right? Like, do Americans land there at some point in time? Or is there, more of a reset culturally in the form of some kind of civil war, which is discussed at length? And people like Ray Dalio now put that probability at more than 50%, right? I don't know what that means, but it's something he says, But like, what's your take? How do you reset that cultural clock, Andrew?
There's a few different ways to reset it. But I would say first and foremost that one of the things we're working against right now that we never had to work against in the past was the rapid application and operationalization of influence factors from our adversaries. China and Russia, as examples, are two countries that fully recognize you should not wake a sleeping giant, right? The reason the United States got involved in World War II was because of the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. That woke the United States up and unified us against a common threat. The same thing happened in 9/11. A divided United States became unified behind a common threat. And let's not forget that what happened from 2001 to 2021, in the 20-year global war on terror, the United States unified for a solid 10 years of that period of time, and we committed some of the most illegal activities across the world that could be executed. Like, we were monsters for those 20 years, all in the name of a global war on terror. And as a result of that, the Bush legacy has been shat upon because of the decisions that were made during those 20 years. You had some of the most embarrassing moments in American history come as a result of the end of that global war on terror. But at the end of the day, it unified us when otherwise we were divided. China's been observing this. They watch that. Russia's been observing this. They know that. So our foreign adversaries know that the worst thing that they can do is take any one action that will unify Americans. So instead, they try to find a way to stay just outside of crossing that line, which is why you see them experimenting in Taiwan, experimenting in Ukraine, experimenting in Syria and Libya, and you see Israel experimenting with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. Like, there's all this probing happening right now to see what is the line where Americans actually care more about what's happening around the world than they care about their own internal conflict. And just letting Americans remain distracted by other Americans. If you can do that, you're essentially neutering them, from beginning to end. So in order for us to have some kind of unifying event, we need to feel either extreme pain or extreme threat. And our adversaries are going to make sure that we don't feel extreme threat. So the real question is, how much pain can we put on ourselves internally before we start to make a significant change, whether that's with immigration, whether that's with economics, whether that's with internal politics, whether that's with executive orders. I mean, we're putting ourselves through more and more pain every day, and we still haven't found a reason to unify.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's the Winston Churchill quote, right? Nothing unifies a country like war, and nothing divides them like the Beatles, right? And it's in our adversaries' better interest that Americans are at home arguing over the Beatles, right? Than unifying behind an international adversary. That's what that really means. And that's rolling out in real time right now. Okay, so a couple questions. I really wanted to get into this. I'm curious, just because you mentioned the 2001 to 2021 timeframe. This is a bit of a pivot, Andrew, but you mentioned some of the nefarious activity that the United States administration was involved with during that time. What can you share about, I'm curious about complicity in the opium trade during that time. And you can look at data points like poppy production from 2001 to 2010 seemed to skyrocket during the American occupation and seemed to plummet once the Taliban took over. Now, it's hard to actually understand, somebody like me, what's really going on the ground. But given enough time and going back a couple more decades to the 80s and the cocaine trade, now there are many stories that seem to be public. Barry Seal, Freeway Ricky Ross, Oliver North, these folks who seem to be sort of complicit in the drug trade and adjacent or involved in the CIA. Is this a real thing? Like, how would you explain the CIA's complicity or not in the drug trade, given what I just shared?
So I wouldn't say it's the CIA's complicitness or complicit activity, as much as I would say that there's a relationship between drugs and illicit finance. So if you consider what was happening in the opium trade in Afghanistan, you had the United States invade Afghanistan. And when we invaded Afghanistan, we were able to make a certain amount of progress through brute force by having the best technology and the biggest guns. But we're not able to destroy the Taliban based exclusively off of big guns, because the Taliban was deeply enrooted culturally across Afghanistan. So in an effort to try to win on the battlefield, but also win at the dinner table, you saw this campaign for the hearts and minds of Afghanistan. And you saw more and more effort and more money go into how do we stimulate the economy locally to make them happy that they were invaded by the United States, right? With that flow of aid money, USAID being chief among them, with that influx of money, you lose control of where the money goes. So you might be paying a community money in order to help it buy water and help it, invest in its students and help it invest in modern medicine and whatever, women's health, and you name it. You name the good reasons why you're infusing money into a community. But that community, some portion of that money is still going to be redirected and used for nefarious activity. In Afghanistan, the opium trade is what funded the war against the United States. And farmers in Afghanistan knew that they had the perfect soil for growing opium, not for growing corn and cabbage. So you might be paying them to grow corn and cabbage, and they might create a few fields of corn and cabbage. And when the local lieutenant from the army comes to check on the status, or when the local USAID representative, who happens to be a contracted Afghan, because that's one of the ways they're infusing money into the local culture, is they're hiring consultants to check on the poppy fields, right? Well, when you've got an Afghani who goes to a farmer and the farmer shows him one field of cabbage, that Afghani comes back to his USAID handler and says, hey, everything's good. They're growing cabbage. They didn't show them the other 25 acres of opium because it's so much easier and productive and profitable to grow that. So instead of growing just opium, they create a minimum viable, cabbage crop, and the rest is dedicated to poppy. So that's kind of how the process works. The United States doesn't want that. They don't want to accept that that's happening, but in an effort to try to gain strategic value through influence, they're going to allow a certain amount of bleed or abuse or fraud to happen. This is this is not uniquely American, but it is pervasive across American culture. All entrepreneurs and business owners know there's a certain amount of fraud, waste, and abuse that you can claim on your taxes every year. There's a certain amount of unpaid invoices you can claim every year. Even if they never happen, you can still claim that they happened, right? Our system is very accepting of abuses and fraudulent activity in an effort to try to maximize the economic benefits. So we export the same thinking that we have here at home, whether that's going to Nicaragua or whether that's going to Afghanistan.
Thank you for that. What can you tell me? I'm curious about the zero unit fighters in Afghanistan, which, as I understand, were sort of American trained Afghan mercenary army that maybe could be utilized to complete night raids, assassinations, extortion, jobs that would allow the United States plausible deniability because they were a bit dirty or on the margin, right? Morally or ethically or otherwise. And a lot of these fighters were escorted back to the United States after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Is that factual? Is there truth in that? What can you share about that, Andrew?
I don't have personal experience that allows me to say how much or how little of that is real. What's important to understand, though, is that whenever the United States participates in any conflict around the world, it is always looking for that hybrid guerrilla unit. In many cases, we have organizations within the United States that are devoted to creating those guerrilla units. The Army Green Berets being chief among them. Their whole job is to create indigenous fighting units that are essentially freedom fighters inside that country, which is just a very nice way of saying, here's a group of people that are American trained, indigenous to that country, who will go carry out operations that are plausibly deniable by the United States. They might even do it with weapons that are purchased with American dollars from American adversaries, so that if the unit is killed, they're killed, and what evidence is acquired is Russian-made munitions and Russian-made scopes and Russian-made weapons purchased by American dollars, but nobody knows that part, right? So there's always a shell game being played around the world to try to make your enemies look bad and try to advance your own national security interests in a way where you keep your hands clean. And that's something that is not just something the United States does. It's something that all competing global power competitors, GPC countries, are participating in, whether it's in the Philippines with the hidden hand of China, whether it's in Poland with the hidden hand of Russia, whether it's in Iran with the hidden hand of Israel. It doesn't matter.
So obviously you've spent a lot of your life assisting American espionage efforts in adversarial countries. Fascinating stories, by the way. What do you know about espionage efforts inside the United States? I know a friend of yours, Sean Ryan, on his podcast recently has been talking a lot about Chinese and Russian mistresses in the Silicon Valley, right? Building romantic relationships with entrepreneurs and gathering intelligence and making a life out of it, right? And that this is actually way more prolific than people seem to understand, that it's common knowledge in the Valley. I didn't know this. What's your take? Sleeper cells, domestic espionage efforts inside the United States?
It's not a good news story, for sure. And I don't think that people are going to be inspired with confidence when I share my perspective and my experience in this, right? Mm-hmm. So first of all, it's important to understand that inside the United States, counterintelligence units are essentially the spy hunters of America. Counterintelligence units are one of the least funded and least favorable units you can belong to. If you're an FBI special agent and you work counterintelligence issues, you're essentially a joke to the rest of the FBI. Because in the hierarchy of sexy assignments, hunting down Russians inside China is not on the top part of that list, right? Instead, you should be closing cases, cracking criminals, breaking up, organized crime rings. There's all sorts of sexy shit you should be doing rather than following another Russian deep cell or sleeper agent for 2 years, in Jacksonville, Florida.
Sure.
So nobody's the job isn't something that the highest performers aspire to carry out. And then the funding isn't there to make sure that they're successful when they get there. Even inside of CIA, there's a counterintelligence office. There's even a counterintelligence office that's dedicated to looking for spies inside of CIA. But these are tiny, highly compartmented offices where the funding is low and none of the high performing officers want to work there because of the impact to their career progression. So as a result of this culture against counterintelligence and protective intelligence inside the United States, you end up having a Swiss cheese effect that actually exists in the United States. When you're carrying out espionage around the world, we have two terms that we use. There's a permissive environment versus a non-permissive environment. A permissive environment means you can operate with relatively low risk of discovery because people are doing something else. A non-permissive environment means that you can't really operate without being discovered because of something like it's a police state or it's a surveillance state or it's heavily controlled. Your non-permissive environments like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China make it very, very difficult for a foreigner to operate in espionage fashion in those countries. But your permissive environments like Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, make it very easy for foreign adversaries to operate in those countries. So the United States being a permissive environment, but then also being the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, while also being a country that has so many freedoms that it's easy to abuse those freedoms, whether it's pretending to be an immigrating foreigner, whether it's using social media to create bot activity, whether it's messing with U.S. currency or messing with crypto markets. Like the United States is so permissive that it's easy and cheap for foreign countries to mess around in the United States. Just as a real simple example to kind of drive this point home, there's probably no more backwards, broken fucking country in the world than North Korea. I think we all agree that North Korea is definitely batshit crazy, led by a batshit crazy leader and full of poverty-stricken dumbass people. However, they have somehow created this incredible crime syndicate that can steal money and steal identities from who? Americans. Americans. Because our environment is so permissive that even the dumb fucks that exist in the North Korean military can find a way to hack into our systems, take advantage of our social security networks, take advantage of our American citizens by making fake phone calls and talking them out of their retirement savings. It's just insane how permissive the United States is to foreign influence and foreign operations.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that there was no prestige in counterintelligence, and therefore there's going to be less talent, and also because there's no funding. And you mentioned all of these things, and during a period with such a fluid border, I had a guest on a year ago, and he worked in counterintelligence in the CIA, and he said it's impossible for any of the intelligence to be good if you don't know who's coming in the country. We have zero idea what we're supposed to, and it's like, I guess he was kind of explaining that. that sounds really terrifying, to be honest.
It's horrible. That's why I wanted, first of all, Jay, I have to compliment you because nobody's ever asked me that question before. Okay. And it's such a clear and present question, right? But nobody's ever asked it before. And it really demonstrates exactly what you're saying, how vulnerable we are. Why are we dealing with, why is the National Counterintelligence Center, NCIC, sending out a warning every 6 months to Americans saying, hey, you can't trust everything you read on social media. And hey, watch out for these scam phone calls and these fake messages that are going to come in and they're trying to steal your identity and steal your money. And why does the FBI have to put out warnings about the vulnerabilities of Android systems? Why do they do this? Because they know that they have no other way of protecting Americans. Because the top talent don't want to work in those offices. And even if they did work in those offices, there's only funding for 1 or 2 people.
So any myth that, America is a surveillance state where every keystroke is recorded and shared among intelligence and facial recognition cameras are close to operating from satellites. Where are we at, Andrew? Is that any reality there or far, far from it?
We are far from anything like that. Do we have the technology that could make it possible? Yes. Mm-hmm. But we don't have the political will. We don't have the security tolerance to let it actually happen.
Which is kind of good, right?
Well, some people would say that. I would actually argue the opposite.
Okay.
I would say that if America really wants to prepare itself to be safe in the future, we need to be a lot more willing to be a heavily policed state. Because right now, our adversaries can operate in the permissive environment that is our backyard. Your neighbor could be a fake, deep cover Chinese operative, a terrorist who's claiming asylum just to get into the country, who's actually a sleeper that's going to wake up in 2 years and blow up some building in Wichita, Kansas or New York City. We are so at risk because we're so afraid of the secrets that we keep, right? The fact that some, Billy Bob nobody is still texting his ex-girlfriend from high school, even though he's been married for 4 years. He's so invested in his personal privacy because he thinks that the American federal government cares that he's considering an affair against his wife.
Right.
When nobody cares.
Nobody cares.
You want to cheat the IRS out of $1,000 in taxes? Even they don't care, right? There's so many things that you can do in the United States that the government, that nobody sees as a national security threat. But in order to protect your secrets, you are willing to let foreigners come into our country nefariously, abuse our system, kidnap our children, create sex slaves, right? Run anything from fentanyl to drugs and other weapons. We're willing to let our national security be threatened in order for us to protect our own personal privacy. That's not going to keep us ahead of the curve in the future.
No, it's such a tough one for people to get their minds around, though, because, if America was a corporation, the brand message is freedom, right? And I often debate this with my in-laws. I love just ribbing them because my in-laws are very, very proud Americans. And we'll probably end up down there. I want to talk to you about this actually, because my wife's American, I'm Canadian, my kids are dual. We'll probably end up back in the US inside of the next 5 years. We're simultaneously putting roots down in Indonesia. We spent about 6 months a year there just for some optionality and, unclear where we may land, keeping our options open. But, I bug my in-laws and I say, the whole concept of American freedom is just a branding campaign. America leads the world in incarcerated citizens per capita. This is the country where you're most likely to end up in a cage, therefore. That can't exist. Simultaneously, the value of freedom, those can't coexist. But, we show you a picture of a bald eagle and a Bud Light and you forget, right? America's free, right? It's just that, right? But that is the brand and that is the identity. And so the argument that although you may reminisce about 1950s America and what we used to be, we're not that anymore. And so gravitating towards a police state, surveillance state may actually protect the freedoms that we have in a counterintuitive way. Yeah.
Yeah, you're totally right. And I think what you're getting at there, aside from the fact that you're razzing your in-laws, which I personally appreciate because I razz my in-laws too. But what you're getting at there is getting back to our original question of America has to decide what it's going to be. 1950s America wasn't free, right? Women weren't free. Children weren't free. African Americans weren't free, right? Blacks weren't free. Like, we were just a different type of oppressive culture. Even today, we are still a different type of oppressive culture, because today, like, at the very least, if you just look at wages, right? Slavery is very real in the United States if you look at it through a lens of wages. There are plenty of people who can't earn enough to actually be able to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of freedom and happiness. Sure. They can't do it. And it's because of the constant kind of shifting morality around capitalism. There's some people who want to treat capitalism like it's oppressive. There's other people who want to treat capitalism like it's opportunistic. There's a third group that want to treat capitalism like it's a responsibility. So we don't even know how we want to handle our own free market. Do we abuse people? Do we trick people? Do we lie to people? Do we empower people? We don't know, because we haven't decided what kind of country we want to be yet, because we're 13 years old, still wearing sweatpants, getting our first boners in math class. It's an awkward phase of our country. We are a far cry from where we started. And let's not beat around the bush. The United States started with white landowning men, and those were the only people who were allowed to vote. So we're far beyond where we were then. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're closer to where we need to be for success. We still have to figure out what's the right balance. Personally, I think it's ridiculous that we let every 18-year-old qualify for voting. What the does an 18-year-old know about picking the future leaders of our country? What investment do they have in our country? Hell, most of the 18-year-olds I know right now don't want a house, don't want a car, don't want to pay taxes, and most of them want to be digital nomads that live in some foreign country. So why would we give them the same quality of vote as a 45-year-old mother or father with 3 children who's been in a career for 22 years, who pays their taxes every year and is trying to develop a life in the United States? It's ridiculous that we treat those two people as equals through the eyes of our electoral process, but we do, right? And that's part of what we have to do, is define what is freedom to the United States. Is it the freedom to pursue opportunity? Is it the freedom as is dictated by saying everybody is equal? Is it the freedom to come and go? Is it the freedom to create a new business? What is freedom in our definition?
Yeah, that's interesting. And you painted the picture of sort of the lower income bracket who would be trapped by the non-discretionary expenses and the ceiling on their income. And you could say, oh, but they're still free to do whatever they want. And there's a story that we could tell that you nod your head and be like, yeah, no, for sure. But mathematically, what's the difference between that and serfdom?
Right.
Like mathematically, right? It's effectively the same situation. There's no escape.
Again, this is one of those things that's, if you get out of the United States, you'll see this around the world, right? Pakistanis and Indians are free to leave their country to pursue higher paying jobs in the Middle East. But once they get to those higher paying jobs, what nobody realizes is they can barely afford to live in the Middle East where they're making this high income job, because the cost of living in UAE or in the Emirates is so high that they don't even have excess income to send back to their home. So when they scrounge an extra 2 or 3% savings for the month and they send it back to India, it makes a big impact on their family back in India, but it essentially locks those people into slavery in the Middle East. Because that's how Middle Eastern employees treat them. Because Middle Eastern employers understand there's always another Pakistani to take your job. So I don't have to pay you more, because if I fire you today, there's going to be 3 more Pakistanis who take the job tomorrow at the same low rate or a lower rate. So this cycle of abuse and serfdom, to use your word, just propagates all over the world.
Okay, so my kids are young. They're 4, 6, and 8. And my wife and I often talk about the advantages we had growing up in countries that were surrounded by opportunity, predictable governance, relatively safe, clean streets, all this stuff. And we've been able to build an amazing life as a consequence of that environment. I'm not super convinced that Canada will provide that same environment over the next 30 years. I could be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong. If managed properly, Canada is a simple country. It's like colossal with almost nobody in it, rich in resources. It's an export nation, right? If you do that right, it works. But if you vilify those industries, it's pretty tough. We're looking at the U.S. We're spending a lot of time in Indonesia, as mentioned, putting down roots, pros and cons. I mentioned I'm debating moving to the U.S. and you laughed, right? And so I want to dig into that. What are your thoughts on relocating young family to the U.S. today in order to capture that opportunity that America's delivered for the last 80 years?
So I think it's important that we frame this through a lens of time.
Okay.
And this is what many adults don't do. It's not about the opportunities today. What you're actually pursuing are the opportunities for your children when they become adults. So your oldest is 8. So you need to be asking yourself, what's the United States going to look like 10 years from now? Mm-hmm. Because that's when your 8-year-old becomes an 18-year-old, when they become a voting member of the American population, when they are qualified to go to college, or when they're able to work, or whatever else it might be. So what is it going to look like in 10 years? Not what does it look like today? Here's how I'm approaching the same question, because my oldest is 12, my youngest just turned 8.
Okay.
The United States that will exist 10 years from now is difficult to identify, because the United States is in this pendulum process right now, just like you said. So if that pendulum process propagates for 2 more presidencies, that's 8 years down the drain of drastic policy changes, drastic cultural changes, drastic infighting, if it continues for 2 more presidential cycles. If we find that we find some sort of stability, we're going to find stability on an extreme. We're not going to find stability in some sort of centrist government. So it's either going to be 8 years of far left practices or 8 years of far right practices. Neither of those is going to give your children the kind of center rational thought process that they need to really thrive and succeed. All of this to say, I think the uncomfortable truth that all parents need to accept right now is that the opportunity for your children comes from you. It's not going to come from a government. It's not going to come from an industry. Again, 1950s America, your commitment to your company yielded results. Your company committed to you. 1980s, 1990s America, your commitment to your country lent to your country's commitment to you. So parents never had to carry the burden of opportunity for their children. All the parents had to do was say, get your ass in school, get good grades, go to college, and you'll be successful. That was the parental responsibility in the past. I tell this to everybody who will listen. If your net worth is $1 million or more, you are the best source of opportunity for your children. You need to shape how they view the world. You need to shape how they view opportunity. You need to teach them resilience. You need to teach them how to identify opportunities on their own, because you're fucking qualified to do it, because you built $1 million net worth yourself, whether that's in a company or as a principal of some other company or an entrepreneur or an investor. You know how to find opportunity and turn ideas into money. If you're worth that much money, you know how to do that. If your net worth is below $1 million, you don't know how to turn ideas into money. And your best opportunity, the best thing that you can do is either learn how to do that or accept that you will never know how to do that, and then try and line your children up to become cogs in the future world so that they can at least have the opportunity to learn how to do the thing you couldn't do. But we need to accept that. We need to accept that. You can have your feelings hurt. You can have your toes stomped on. You can have your face slapped, but that is the bottom line. If you know how to turn ideas into money, you need to teach your children how to do that, because that will guarantee their freedom for the rest of their life. And that will be the legacy that carries on with your family name. But if you're a wage slave now, trading your time for money, and you don't know how to turn ideas into money, the best thing that you can do is just set your children up to have better opportunity than what you had, so that hopefully they can be the ones that break that cycle and change the legacy of your family name.
Oh man, dude, I love that. That's powerful. And, my wife and I chat about that often. Like, what's the success picture look like if we did a good job, 10, 15 years down the road? And where we landed is like, if we've instilled creativity, confidence, and persistence in our boys, then we've probably done okay, given that we have no idea what the economy might look like in 10 years. But a creative person will always find a place,
Yes.
They can solve problems, come up with it, but they need the confidence to actually put that creativity into the world, not just sit at home and sit on their idea, too timid to implement. And then persistence, obviously, because that first idea is going to suck, and the second idea might suck too, but eventually you might get it right if you're persistent, right?
And that's how you know that that right there, Jay, is how the whole world understands why you're successful. Because
right.
You can sit there and say the first idea will probably suck, and so might the second, and so might the third. How many people think every idea they have is a fucking great idea?
Right.
Like, trust me, I've had lots more bad ideas, lots more failed ideas than I've had successful ideas. And that's something that you only learn with trial and error. That's why it takes persistence. And that's why I have no doubts about your family. Your kids are going to be great. Your kids are going to have massive success. And here's the really sad underbelly of it all. If you just look at it empirically, the children who have parents who have resources now are going to become children who have resources that they can create on their own in the future. And that population is getting smaller and smaller because wealthy people have fewer children. And those fewer children are going to have fewer children still because they're going to keep having children later in life. They're going to continue to devote themselves to the responsibility of building resources before they build family. So the wealth gap in the United States will continue to get larger and larger and larger, which means that you will continue to have more and more population with less and less money. That is a guaranteed recipe for unrest. That's a guaranteed recipe for crime. That's a guaranteed recipe for instability. So if you really want to know why I hope my children choose to become global citizens first, rather than American citizens first, it's because the United States that is almost guaranteed to occur is going to be in America with a huge wealth gap that is going to contribute to more crime, more civil unrest, and more instability in the future. And my children could raise their families anywhere else in the world and have less of that instability than we have here in the United States. There's no good place, but at any given time, there's always a comparatively better place.
So let me ask you, because you were a true insider. A lot of folks, claim insider status, but you were on boots on the ground, completing very high risk missions for the CIA. You're now an entrepreneur. You got kids. I'm always curious about the mission behind your business. That's a big pivot, right? And there's probably a lot behind it. So what is the mission behind Everyday Spy, Andrew, and what are you trying to accomplish?
We actually have a very clear mission statement, and I thank my experience with the military and with CIA for that. Our mission is spy education to break barriers. That's it. We want to teach people real-world spy education that breaks barriers in their everyday life for anyone willing to learn, not just the people willing to pay, but anyone willing to learn, which is why we have so many free outlets as well, whether it's free PDFs or free YouTube channel or free podcasts. Like, we want to break barriers for everyone. Because what I learned at CIA is that at any given time, 80% of the people that you reach will not take action. 20% of the people you reach will take action. But even of the 20% that take action, you can break them into another group of 80-20. So of the 20% that take action, 80% won't take enough action or won't take the correct action, and 20% will. So of 100% of the people that you meet, only about 7% will have success based off of what you teach. That's why our mission is to touch as many lives as possible. Because if only 7% of people are really going to succeed, it's our responsibility to touch as many lives as possible to grow the population that lives inside that 7%. And the whole reason that I care so much about it is because I was one of the 7% that was accepted to CIA. I was one of the 7% that made it to operational status. I was one of the 7% that made it to senior levels of leadership within CIA. So I know what it's like to be part of that small population and to see the exponential opportunities that come when you're part of the 7%. And I owe that to everybody because CIA changed my life, and CIA changed my life on the back of the American taxpayer's dollar. That's what paid for my CIA education. That's what paid for my CIA operations. That's what paid for every life-changing experience that CIA gave me, the American taxpayer. So now I have a chance to feed that same American taxpayer from my own platform.
And so connecting the dots, given what we just discussed for the last hour and the mission of Everyday Spy, it's kind of like is it like a tool for sovereignty? That's kind of how I interpret it, right? Like we can't control the noise. We can often not even understand it all, but that matters less if you're able to step back and orchestrate your own reality, orchestrate your own life, decoupled from whatever frameworks have been forced upon you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We think of it as a mission for freedom, but freedom is self-defined. For some people, freedom means financial freedom and wealth. For other people, freedom means being able to make a living doing what you love. Maybe that's only $35,000 a year, but you're doing what you love. For some people, freedom is just being able to have a child, right? For any homosexual couple out there that can't genetically have their own child without advancements in science, like they have the freedom to have children if they can get the right job, or if they can save enough money, or if they can tap into the right network. So freedom is very personal to all of us. But what I learned about CIA is, or what CIA taught me that's so powerful, is they created this image for me where human beings are a giant fight, like a backyard brawl or like a mosh pit, right? They stand in a group and they slap each other and they punch each other and they step on each other's toes, and some people get knocked down and some people get trampled on. And unless you are willing and deliberate in getting out of the mosh pit and watching what happens, you're just going to get chewed up inside the mosh pit. And in both situations, you can't control the mosh pit. Right. You can't control what happens in the world, but you get to choose whether you're a victim to what happens in the world or whether you're an observer of what happens to the world. And if you choose to be an observer, you have more information, more opportunity, more choices than if you're the poor bastard in the middle.
Dude, I feel like, this is, we didn't even get into this. And so I got to have you back on because, we're now entering the next stage of big tech integration into our lives, right? And I was reading this morning about our AI companionship, right? This sort of next product rollout, right? And it's horrifying. It's one of these things where we're always terrified of new tech as it unravels or as it rolls out to us, but we adopt it 100% of the time. You know what I mean? So it's going to happen. We're going that direction. And I found myself thinking, what's the tools, right, that you can leverage the utility of the technology, but not be seduced into just becoming an addict of the product, right? Which is what most people will unfortunately end up becoming, right? And they'll perpetuate into deeper levels of loneliness and isolation down these weird rabbit holes, right? I got back to spirituality. I was like, people need God right now. This is what we need, right? I'm bringing that home. But I just feel like probably the tools at Everyday Spy are directly aligned with that, right? Giving you the mental fortitude to step outside of the framework and be the observer, not the addict of the product.
Not the target. That's exactly right.
Not the target.
Just to tell you a funny story that came to mind when you were sharing that, I am very future oriented. So I am, of course, an early adopter of AI. When I was at CIA back in 2007, we were using AI. We were just using the precursor of what is now known as commercial AI because the government can afford, cutting edge technology. So we were using AI in 2007, 2008 in the global war on terror. And we were using a much more rudimentary form of what you and I can access from our cell phones today.
Right.
But my point is, I was recently going through an AI integration process and implementation in my company. And I was engaging through prompts directly with an AI platform that we were integrating into our company. And as I was giving my responses and my prompts, my inputs, the AI would respond back like a person. And they would respond back using a formula, a psychological formula to build trust with me that I could identify because it's the same fucking formula that CIA taught me to use to build trust with targets.
Sure.
So I started testing the AI and I was like, let's see what happens if I tell it something that's vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
I had a fight with my wife last night, so I'm a little bit stressed out today. And no shit, the AI responded with a psychological manipulation tactic to build trust with me by siding against my wife, right? Where it was like, oh, well, I'm sure that the argument was important to you and she probably made you feel like you were not being listened to, but don't hold it against her. I'm sure she still loves you. I'm like, this is just a program talking to me.
Yeah.
But the program can better replicate the skills that CIA teaches us as people, because the program is literally just ones and zeros. It's doing what it knows to do. I mean, these are the same things that we teach at Everyday Spy so that people can have success at work, have success in their relationships, have success in parenthood, have success with sales. And the AI is doing it to me better than my own students do it back to me, because people have to deal with all their own preconceived notions and previous conditioning, where an AI doesn't. So I say that because you're exactly right. AI is going to manipulate us, not because there's anything wrong with the AI. It's not sentient. The problem is that the program driving the AI is flawless. It's based on the best psychological research available to date. So, of course, it's going to win in every manipulative conversation. It's going to win in every debate. It's going to win in every dialogue. You know,
the manipulation is clutch. And you mentioned like it identified a vulnerability and then jumped onto it right away. And, you know, one of these, today I was just, because I'm trying to play with a few of these just so I understand them better. And this morning I was playing with Grok's new character, whatever this is. Now when you open it up, it's suddenly a very seductive music starts and there's this little thing in a mini skirt who's now your AI assistant, right? She's very seductive. And I found myself thinking, like, I've got a beautiful wife that I'm madly in love with. I've got 3 amazing kids. I've got a business that really inspires me. Like, I've got all these really firm anchor points. I'm a tough guy to push off my focus, right? But I'm like I'm in the minority. I'm aware of that, right? And I'm not one of the vulnerable, easy targets, the low-hanging fruit for an app like this to get pulled off course and sucked down that rabbit hole. But there's a lot of targets like that, you know, and it just came back to like, we need a bigger purpose. It's very important to have that bigger purpose and that bigger framework of thinking to make yourself a bit more robust and formidable against opponents like this.
And it's important to keep that in mind because your opponents are not just foreign countries. Your opponents are the American free market system, right? In the United States, where does the majority of tax revenue come from? It comes from consumer behavior, because every product has a sales tax. Every hotel you stay at has a tax for the room, a tax for the state, a tax for the price that you paid. So the United States needs people to constantly pay taxes on everything that they consume. So they encourage a consumer mentality. And all that you see in the world of AI and the world of tech generation is more stuff that people can buy, more stuff that people can consume. And the US federal government loves the idea of non-fungible products because they can be scaled infinitely, they can go viral, and they cost no natural resources. So, of course, we want more people to buy more financial engines. And of course, we want more people to engage with AI. And we want more people to fall victim to the AI in the miniskirt, because maybe that's going to help them buy more shit on Amazon or invest more money in cryptocurrency or, you know, who knows what. Try to start a business which generates more taxes and more sales and more revenue. It's not the American government is not on our side. The American government is not there to help the American people thrive. It's there to ensure the future of the American government. And a big part of that future is tied to creating a scalable, reliable, and resilient tax base that continues to fund the world's most powerful military and the world's innovative engine.
Man, I've really enjoyed this conversation, Andrew. I'm really glad you're able to make the time. And I feel like we've got a part 2 here. I just want to dive into sort of big tech platforms next. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you and picking your brain. And I think you've got a unique ability to really sort of decouple binary outcomes. We tend to look at things and think it's this or that. And you can say, no, it's often both and usually both, right? Things can be good and bad. And it's your job to read that room and then operate accordingly, right? To your best interest. Thank you so much for the time today. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, man, absolutely. And I'm glad you enjoyed the conversation because a lot of times it's all like fire and brimstone and it can be real doom and gloom. But I agree with you. You've got to see the truth for what it is if you're going to find the path that leads you to success.
I love it, man. All right. Most investors think they're playing it safe, following mainstream advice, chasing trends, and clinging to the herd mentality. But there is nothing safe about mainstream advice. The smartest investors know that real wins come from thinking independently and spotting opportunities long before the crowd. And that's what we teach at the Commodity University. This is an exclusive membership designed to arm you with the skills from the sharpest minds in the mining investment world. Each of our professionals has a proven track record of finding trends before anyone else. At the Commodity University, you'll gain access to a highly curated and growing catalog of courses covering what you actually need to know to become an informed commodity investor. Every single month, you'll receive a brand new course packed with insights from the best in the business, giving you the edge to stay ahead. If you're tired of following the crowd and ready to invest smarter, think sharper, and understand the mining industry like the professionals, then take the next step and join the Commodity University today.